Senator from Rhode Island.
Mr. President, let me thank our Democratic leader for that very kind intro. I will confess that I come to the Senate floor today with a pretty heavy heart. The effort that we are engaged in right now is going to be extremely damaging to our country. We're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars in cuts to Medicaid that are part of the plan here. And we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars in cuts to Medicaid that are coming on top of this tariff madness emanating from the White House that was already estimated to cost families north of $3,000 a year in added costs for the same stuff. Average $3,000 per year per family. And that was before the retaliatory tariffs came back. So that's kind of the baseline. Trump campaigned on lowering costs, and the first thing he's done is to raise costs by thousands and thousands of dollars for American families. On top of that, their pensions and 401ks got slaughtered. I think it's about $3 trillion in value lost because of this maniacal tariff effort that gives nobody any confidence about which way we're going to go. Set aside how bad the tariffs are, like the lesson the last time we tried this, back in the Depression era, isn't obvious enough that tariffs harm the economy unless they're precise and intelligent and purposeful and focused, which these are by definition not. But just the uncertainty, just the fact that every day it's a different tariff, it's another number. It's such a ham-handed gong show over at the White House that the White House website and the White House press conference put out different numbers for the same companies. This whole thing is like being run by the Keystone Cops, but they're playing with economic dynamite. And between what's about to happen to Medicaid, which supports so many folks, mothers and fathers, aunts and uncles in nursing homes, that support so many folks, spouses, sisters, when they give birth, that support so many folks, family members who are in addiction recovery and are getting support from programs in Medicaid. When you kick out elderly family members from nursing homes, you're doing a real blow to a family on top of the $3,000 plus, on top of the hammered 401k or pension. So this is a very, very grim time for American families economically, and there is no sense or logic behind it. There's big talk, but it is really economic nonsense that's happening around us right now. And into this comes, like that's not bad enough, a complete disavowal, a completely hypocritical repudiation of things that Republicans have claimed to believe in for a long, long time. And what we're seeing in this budget reconciliation process is massive lies exposed. The first one is that Republicans care about the debt and the deficit. Let me tell a few stories about my time as chairman of the Budget Committee. As chairman of the Budget Committee, I paid a lot of attention to what climate change portends for the American economy. And the reason I did that is because there's some pretty damned serious and very dire warnings that are out there and that come from some pretty darned serious people Not Green New Dealers, but really significant people, often ones who have a fiduciary duty to get this right. They can't be like the fossil fuel industry and lie at an industrial scale about climate change, because they have a fiduciary duty to tell the truth and get it right. And in particular, that's the insurance industry. I'll show you, last April, The Economist magazine, cover article, the next housing disaster. The next housing disaster is what they predicted could be a $25 trillion hit to the global real estate asset class. Why? Because of climate risk. Because if you can't get insurance on a property, you can never again get a mortgage on that property. And when most Americans still buy their property with a mortgage, it's fine if you're one of Trump's billionaires and you swap properties around paying cash. But if you're like most Americans and need a mortgage to buy your property, or if you're like most homeowners and when you want to sell your property, you need to find somebody who can buy it with a mortgage, well, if your property won't support a mortgage any longer because your property is too dangerous to insure, here's what the chief economist for Freddie Mac said about that. He said that you have an insurance crisis in homeowners' property insurance, which we are already seeing in Florida. This is not a prediction in the future. This is a now thing. We are in the early stages of this. It is happening. Ernest Hemingway was asked how you go bankrupt. He said, gradually, and then all at once. We're into gradually already, and we don't know when all at once will happen, but when it's $25 trillion out of the world's largest asset class, that is a massive economic hit to our economy. So the insurance crashes. Right behind that comes the mortgage crash. Right behind that comes the property values crash because no mortgages. And that leads to another recession, according to the chief economist of Freddie Mac, the American mortgage giant. And he made that prediction of insurance crash to mortgage crash to property values crash to national economic crash based just on the risk to coastal properties. You see here how they use the ocean, tearing away at the underpinnings of the real estate. He was looking at coastal property risk. He was talking about a coastal property values crash. Well, guess what? Coastal risk now has an evil sibling that is just as bad and maybe worse, which is wildfire risk. Look at what happened to LA. Look at how wildfire seasons have become year-round in parts of the West. Look how wildfire area has expanded beyond traditional wildfire risk areas. Between coastal risk and wildfire risk, our insurance markets are taking a beating, and that's the cascade into economic recession. A third of our debt comes from economic hits to our economy, COVID and 2008. So if we're going to be serious about the deficit and about debts, we've got to be serious about the major risks to the economy. So The Economist is one of these warnings, but just to show how serious this is, I want to go through a couple of others. Allianz. Allianz is one of the biggest insurance companies in the world. And one of its board members just wrote an article saying, climate change, if we don't fix it soon, is going to be the end of the insurance industry business model. And that is going to cascade into other parts of the economy where insurance is essential to support the other industry. Well, mortgages is an obvious one. But there are others, because throughout the financial system, there are deals that are held together because of insurance policies. So he predicted, the headline was really extreme. The headline was, end of capitalism. I don't know that that's true, but you can sure as heck expect a very significant economic wipeout as the insurance markets collapse in the face of unpredictable risk. So that was Allianz. Jay Powell, chairman of the Fed, wants nothing to do with climate, doesn't want to talk about it. He's not green one bit. But he testified about 3 weeks ago in the Senate Banking Committee that in 10 to 15 years, there'll be whole regions of the country where you can't get a mortgage any longer. There's that cascade. No insurance, no mortgage, property value crash, recession. The Fed chair is confirming that domino in 10 to 15 years will fall. The mortgage bankers, my God, talk about a group that's not green. The mortgage bankers have written a report called The Impact of Climate Change on Housing and Housing Finance. And Mr. President, I would ask unanimous consent to ask that the executive summary of that report be put into the record at the end of my remarks.
Without objection.
So you've got The Economist magazine, which is not green at all, very conservative international publication. You've got Allianz, one of the insurance giants of the world. You've got the chairman of the Federal Reserve. You've got the Mortgage Bankers Association. What else have we got? Well, the Financial Stability Board. The Financial Stability Board is the board that warns the world banking system of risks to the world banking system that it has to prepare for. What did they just warn the world's banking system? Better get ready for this risk. Better get ready for this risk. For two reasons, actually. One is, when the insurance crash wipes out mortgages, it wipes out a huge revenue part of the banking system. The second is, after you've lost all that revenue, because mortgages aren't available in whole regions of the country any longer, then you have the problem that banks are solvent or not, in large part dependent on what is called their loan-to-value ratio. And their value depends on the value of the properties against which they hold the mortgages. If the value of a property crashes because it no longer can support a mortgage and can't be sold to anybody except somebody who can pay cash, or because the carrying cost of the property insurance has gotten so great, if it goes from $4,000 or $5,000 a year to $16,000 to $20,000 a year, that crashes the value of that property. And when that property value goes down, the bank has to keep track of that. And when they go underwater on a loan, when the amount that they have loaned out becomes less than the value of the property, and when that is happening across the board, particularly for regional banks in a region where you can't get mortgages any longer and property values have crashed, you've got a serious banking solvency problem. And that is what the Financial Stability Board reports. I would commend that report to anybody who can put up with complicated economic terminology. It is not a fun read, but it's pretty telling when the body responsible for economic stability in the world's banking system is putting out these warnings. So you got The Economist, you got Allianz, you got Chairman Powell, you got the mortgage bankers, you got the Financial Stability Board. I've mentioned already Freddie Mac's chief economist who explained how this cascade works. More recently, another group called First Street just stood up, and they showed what's going to happen in specific areas where property values are going to crash, where premiums are going to soar. Property values down by as much as 100%, total wipeout. Premiums quadrupling in places. And then Deloitte comes along, the corporate consulting firm, not green at all, and they warn that if we screw up on climate, if we continue to screw up on climate, versus if we get it right, the swing 50 years out from now will be $220 trillion in world GDP. So I spent a lot of time talking about this in the Budget Committee. Did my Republican friends want to hear about it? No. Why not? Because that party is funded by the fossil fuel industry and can't bear a serious discussion about climate, can't bear looking at the lies that the fossil fuel industry dispenses in industrial levels. They have a whole apparatus of fraud, front groups with funny names that constantly put out false information, people who pretend to be scientists and cook up fake science that comes not out of labs and research, but out of Madison Avenue in propaganda firms. And so what they said to me over and over again was, why are you talking about climate? That doesn't have anything to do with the budget. You need to be talking about deficits. You need to be talking about debt. They're all about how our children are going to have their futures imperiled by deficits and debt. Well, they're going to have their futures imperiled by climate change, is what pretty much anybody who's sensate still is showing. But oh my God, how much talk I had to listen to, how much self-serving, self-aggrandizing talk I had to listen to about how we really had to deal with our debt and deficit problem. Well, look at what they're up to now. The Senate budget that the Republicans are pushing blows the deficit through the roof. By 2035, doubles it. Our national debt, I said the deficit, I meant our national debt. We are talking here about $60 trillion in debt. Where was we want to raise it to $60 trillion in debt when I was getting all these lectures in the Budget Committee from all my Republican friends about how the most important thing was our national debt? The House budget resolution is no better, just as bad. 30 trillion goes to 56 trillion. And if you look at some of the numbers here, we got a letter back. I asked unanimous consent to have the letter here added at the end of my remarks. It comes from
Without objection.
the Joint Committee on Taxation. It's their job to review these things. It begins, Dear Senator Whitehouse, Senator Wyden, Mr. Neal, and Mr. Boyle. This letter is in response to your request for revenue estimates to extend permanently the individual tax provisions, et cetera. We asked, what's it really going to cost for the Republicans to do this stuff? Well, here at the bitter end, you actually get to the numbers. And the numbers are that the total of the tax provisions just over 10 years, just to like here, goes up $4.6 trillion. And then, because you've got to borrow money to fund that additional $4.6 trillion that Republicans want to add to our debt, the actual number settles out at $5.5 trillion. $5.5 trillion added to our national debt. After all those lectures I got about how you couldn't pay any attention to climate change while their pockets are stuffed with fossil fuel money, metaphorically, and instead we get really focused on the deficit, and the first chance they have to focus on the deficit and the debt, what are they doing? Up $5.5 trillion, trillion with a T. And if you throw in the new tax breaks on top of the 5.5 that we asked about, it goes to $7 trillion. $7 trillion. And the Senate Republicans, here's where it gets really sick, because they're cheating the budget process. They get to the lie that this won't cost money by cheating. They're planning to simply ignore what the Congressional Budget Office said, ignore what the Joint Committee on Taxation calculated. They're planning to dodge the parliamentarian and just make up numbers on their own and ignore what the statute says, contrary to 5 decades of law and practice. The budget law, for instance, includes a section telling CBO how to count tax cuts. They ignore that section. They just make up their own numbers. You don't need to be a budget expert to figure out that $7 trillion in tax cuts are going to worsen the budget. going to worsen the debt. And in fact, we kept bringing in witnesses to talk about the debt and the deficit, and the Republicans could never produce a witness that said that tax cuts pay for themselves. Scott Hodge from the Conservative Tax Foundation, who was a witness called to the Budget Committee by the Republicans, said the Tax Foundation modeled every iteration of what became the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which is the Trump tax scam 1.0, and at no time did our model ever predict that it would pay for itself. The model does not estimate that virtually any tax cut will pay for itself. That's a kind of a myth that has been created. So it is really frustrating to hear colleagues who lectured me and lectured me and lectured me as their excuse to ignore the very plain climate economic risk we are facing about how we really had to deal with the debt, and then when they have the chance, what they're doing is they're blowing it through the roof. And to do that, they're going to hack away at Medicaid. And at the end of the day, most of this goes to the very rich. The original thought was out of $4 trillion, it was $2+ trillion going just to a very small group of extremely rich people and very big corporations. Our tax code is riddled with corruption. We could raise a lot of money and actually fix the deficit by pulling out the corruption, but the big businesses would squeal and scream because they don't like paying taxes. And for a long time, they haven't had to. In what some of my colleagues seem to think are the good old days, that's the 1950s. The good old days in America when men were men and life was good. Corporations contributed 30% of America's revenue. Corporations contributed 30% of America's revenue. And look at what's happened to it year after year, after their lobbyists have come here, after they've written checks to Republican super PACs, after they've worked this building, they're down to about under 10%. They've been down as low as 6%. And by the way, it's not because corporations got smaller and poorer in that time. They're bigger than ever. The fossil fuel industry alone made the biggest profits in corporate history, gouging American consumers after international prices went up post Putin's invasion of Ukraine. There's plenty we could do to solve the debt problem. But oh my God, the flagrancy of the lie about concern about the deficit is pretty stunning. The other thing that they have said, and I'll close with this, the other thing that they have said is, oh, we have to defend the filibuster at all costs. Oh, we can't do the nuclear option. Oh, the only time we'd possibly ever use the nuclear option is when the Democrats did it first. So they did a nuclear option to put their people onto the Supreme Court and blamed it on Harry Reid because he had done the same thing for the D.C. Circuit after they'd put up a firewall around the D.C. Circuit. But since then, it's been, we will never, 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 never blow up the filibuster. We will never use the nuclear option. Well, here's where we are with the parliamentarian right now. They have done an end run around getting a determination on whether this stunt that they're pulling by pretending that these tax cuts don't have any economic effect, don't add to the debt, will get reviewed by the parliamentarian. I will tell you one thing. There have probably been documents brought to the Senate floor before that contained a lie. But I can't think of one that has been brought to the Senate floor that both contained a lie and that lie's own rebuttal in the same document. The lie is that all these tax cuts for billionaires and big corporations won't add to the debt. That is imaginary, that is fake, that is not economically possible, but they say it. And then in the same document, they lift the debt limit by $5 trillion. If these tax breaks don't have any cost, don't add to the debt, why do they need to raise the debt limit by $5 trillion? The problem is, it's very hard to go into the parliamentarian's office and say, this is legit, because at the same time I'm lying that it's free and adding $5 trillion in debt limit because it obviously isn't free. When you're dealing with a debt limit, you're dealing with banks and Treasury and people who can't participate in the Senate hothouse lie that this doesn't cost $5 trillion. And so you have these two things side by side in the same bill, the lie and its own rebuttal baked right in. How do you get that by the parliamentarian? Very hard to do, so they skip. But the problem is that sooner or later, there will be a parliamentary ruling. And maybe they hope that they've got so much steam built up that the parliamentarians will just roll over. Or maybe this whole thing just blows up and the parliamentarian says, no, you can't do that. You have a lie and its own rebuttal in the exact same document. You can't pretend that this is a true thing, and therefore it's not compliant with the budget laws for all of the reasons I mentioned earlier. Out of compliance with CBO, out of compliance with Joint Committee on Taxation, out of compliance with proper reporting, all of it. So what does that mean? That means that at some point, the time will come when the parliamentarian says, nope, and blows the whistle. They think that that's going to happen already, which is why they're doing the end run. And when the day comes that it actually happens, that's when they have to go to the nuclear option, because otherwise all of this will have been in vain. So we're on a path to the nuclear option. Pretty much everything Republicans have claimed to stand for is destroyed in this process. The hypocrisy alert about the deficit and the debt, and now they're raising it by huge numbers. When you have to put real numbers in the document, you simply deny them, even though the debt numbers prove the lie. When there are budget rules that we've honored for decades, going to ignore them, just blow it through. Parliamentarian, end run around the parliamentary folks, and then at the end, go nuclear after saying we'd never, 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 never do that. This whole thing is such a con and such a shame and will cause so much damage to families dependent on Medicaid, all so they can give billions of dollars in tax breaks to big corporations and to billionaires who don't need it. In fact, their share of federal revenue has gone down by from over 30% to below 10%. They have just walked away from their responsibilities to help fund America. They left that on the backs of regular taxpayers, and it's not enough for them to be under 10%. They want more. They want to get that down to what, 5%, 4%? Nothing, be complete freeloaders? This thing is an embarrassment. And I will say I rest my case. But when you actually look at their debt limit numbers, maybe I should say they rest my case. I yield the floor.